Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA and Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, July 20th. We will be hearing the presentation, Publication Spotlight, the 2018 State of Transportation Planning. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call that 1-800 number shown. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type your questions in the box located in your webinar toolbar. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up on your screen is a list of our sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2018. Thanks to all the participating chapters and divisions for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you're looking down the list and you don't see your chapter or division listed, we just ask that you reach out to them and ask them to join us. Today's webcast in particular is sponsored by the Transportation Planning Division of APA. You can learn more about them and all the divisions at planning.org/divisions. Up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts for the rest of July and the first part of August. And you can register for these by visiting our webcast webpage at ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. To log your credits for attending today's webcast, just head over to planning.org and log into your My APA account, and then you can search for CM activities either by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. And like us on Facebook Planning Webcast Series to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. And this webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for distance education. Just head over to our webcast webpage for more info. And like us, we will be recording today's presentation. It will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast. And we'll also have a PDF available at the end of the presentation on our webcast webpage. Again, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. Okay, I am now going to turn it over to Gabriela Juarez, who will be talking to you a little bit about the Transportation Planning Division and kind of framing today. Gabriela, I am turning it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Christine. I really appreciate what the consortium provides all of divisions and chapters in terms of having this webinar capacity. I wanted to welcome everyone to today's special webinar on our 2018 State of Transportation publication, where we have members provide us with the latest and greatest of what's happening in the transportation field. And so we wanted to also offer it as a webinar in addition to the publication. So today is just a little snippet of all of the wonderful happenings and articles that we have in the actual publication. And I do encourage you to join the division if you are not a member. I know that APA is a bit pricey, so if being an APA member is not something that is a financial opportunity for you, you still can join the division as a standalone item for $25. And you get benefits such as access to the State of Transportation publication, newsletters, e-blasts, as well as wonderful webinars like today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first presenters from our favorite city in the world, Los Angeles, David Summers and Karina Macias, who work for the LADOT Department of Transportation, doing amazing things in our new millennium and modern day. So with that, thank you, Dave and Karina.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for tuning in to hear more about how LA is using technology to deliver urban mobility. I am Karina Macias, a Transportation Planning Associate at the City of Los Angeles Department of Transportation.
And I'm David Summers, the Supervising Transportation Planner leading LADOT's Planning Policy Division.
So I'm going to start off by providing some context as to why LADOT and the City of Los Angeles prepared this technology strategy. Most planning professionals would agree that people's increasing reliance on our mobile devices and importance of digital presence have influenced a major shift in travelers' transportation preferences and expectations for service quality. These culture changes embrace new mobility products and services we see on our streets today. These services tend to be on demand, shared, and/or offer real-time information. Nearly 2 years ago now, our city prepared a transportation technology strategy, whose cover you see on the screen now, titled Urban Mobility in a Digital Age, to guide our department into an exciting and pretty unpredictable new age in transportation. LA's technology strategy defines key actions that our department will accomplish in its tools to invest in and manage technologies that help us achieve the goals defined by our city's plans and policies. Our city's goals for safe, equitable, and sustainable mobility are defined by policies and objectives in the mobility element of our general plan, the Mayor's Sustainable City Plan, and our department's strategic plan. The transportation technology strategy and the accompanying strategic implementation plan, which was released just a little bit less than a month ago, identify the actions needed to achieve this future. For decades, Los Angeles and many other California cities have reviewed proposed development based on anticipated impacts to intersection and street level of service ratings. This approach restricted infill development and motivated planners of the past to widen streets to avoid vehicle delay. The development review process that prioritized free flow vehicle movement helped develop many of the challenges our city and our department is solving today. To better estimate the impacts of proposed development on our transportation system and the environment, our team invested in various data sets that would demystify travel patterns within our city and empower us to model and monitor more meaningful metrics, such as vehicle miles traveled per person. Our presentation today, as well as the article in the publication, focuses on why and how our city built data-informed transportation planning tools, which is one of the many ways that LADOT is implementing LA's transportation technology strategy. Since our city is situated at the center of a polycentric region characterized by dispersed communities and employment centers, it was important for us to invest in high-quality transportation data from our region to build a tool that links transportation and land use decisions.
So we collected trip data from housing and mixed-use sites in our city. We focused trip collection on affordable housing sites. A missing data set in the Institute of Transportation Engineers Trip Generation Handbook to verify the low driving trips of building affordable housing stock. We have already adjusted our rates to better reflect lower driving demand of lower income households. We updated our travel demand forecasting model to better estimate vehicle miles traveled and to provide a more accurate picture of trip making in our city. We calibrated calculations and validated model outputs using large data sets collected from GPS-connected vehicles and mobile devices in our regional system of in-road vehicle detectors. This helped increase the model sensitivity to reporting the miles component of the vehicle miles traveled metric. We used the local trip counts at mixed-use projects to calibrate a mixed-use trip generation data set that is more responsive to built urban context at densities and mixed uses and transit access as seen in Los Angeles. By relying on local trip generation rates, we can better assure that our modeling tools reflect transportation travel characteristics specific to LA, building a greater transparency in the planning decisions. We used outputs from our travel demand forecasting model and trip generation rates to build a customized vehicle miles traveled calculator to evaluate transportation demand impacts for local land use projects. The VMT Calculator will be a tool available to transportation practitioners as well as the general public, and helps advance another goal of the transportation strategy in terms of building platforms of a better transportation experience. The first step in LA's planned project review process starts with the project screening criteria, which defines the types of projects that are not required to submit a technical analysis. Step 2 of the new process requires project applicants to analyze their proposed project impacts on vehicle miles traveled using the city's customized VMT calculator, or the regionally significant projects run our updated travel demand forecasting model directly. The VMT calculator is an Excel-based, locally calibrated tool that requests the users to input their project's location, planned land uses, and project size to estimate its proposed project's vehicle miles traveled. It was customized using local travel characteristics for each part of the city, based on data from the city's travel demand model, based on the transportation analysis zones where the project is located. It also provides the user with options to include a wide range of transportation demand management strategies proven to reduce vehicle miles traveled based on the site's distance to high-quality transit, surrounding land use diversity and population densities, and the street network connectivity. Mitigation options included in the travel demand forecasting model include a suite of services and strategies that include parking management, transit incentives, so that would be like bulk rate transit purchases or a transit subsidy for occupancy of the use of if either a unit or if it's being leased. Educational and marketing programs just to give information about where transit is located, and also other commute trip reductions, and also linking to the emerging shared mobility services that are becoming more prevalent in the city, such as bike share or car share services. On the right side of the screen, you could see that the VMT calculator reports vehicle miles traveled per capita before and after transportation demand management strategies are selected for the site. So it gives immediate outcome of what the VMT is, just based on the basic basic project attributes. The final step of the new project review process includes the monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of the vehicle miles traveled at the project site after the project is constructed and in operation. By focusing on vehicle miles traveled, we can better relate the choices we make during a project evaluation and outcomes that people care about, such as relying more on our transit system and transit incentives and other types of services that are becoming more prevalent in the city. The updated development project review process builds on an information feedback loop in our city's planning process. We will monitor the development's average vehicle ridership data, where we'll have applied a TDM program, and further calibrate our vehicle miles traveled calculator to even more accurately reflect the desired project outcomes around trip making after these projects are in operation. Through this evaluation and feedback process, we'll be building a better data foundation leading to greater public transparency. So that's our presentation that we have today, and we'll be glad to hear your questions.
And now we're kicking it off to David Heller.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
You look and sound good.
Thank you. Well, the looking, I'm not sure because you can't see me, but anyway, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for those on the West Coast. My name is David Heller, and I work as a program manager for the South Jersey Transportation Planning Organization, the MPO for Southern New Jersey. I will be talking about planning for autonomous vehicles, distilling reality from fantasy. Just a brief disclaimer, just the contents of this report reflect my views, and they do not reflect the views of the SJTPO or any of our member jurisdictions. So first, what is an autonomous vehicle? Autonomous cars, they're also known as driverless cars, self-driving cars, robotic cars. It's a vehicle that is capable of sensing its environment and navigating without human input. It uses a variety of techniques to detect its surroundings, including radar, laser light, GPS, odometry, and computer vision. Now, a related but not identical technology is connected vehicles. And connected vehicles allow vehicles to communicate with each other and the world around them. And many of today's vehicles include connected vehicle functionality. A good example is the GPS systems, which receive congestion information on the road ahead of them and then will map an alternative route if necessary. Who's developing these autonomous vehicles? And there are quite a few of the major manufacturers are getting into the business. On the left is the Tesla Model S. There's the Ford Fusion on the right-hand side. There's also Google Waymo, GM Cruise LV, which is the image at the bottom of your screen, and Daimler Bosch. According to a recent APA report, 11 of the largest automakers plan to have fully autonomous vehicles on the road between now and 2021. Now, this next slide, maybe some of you have seen this, but basically it's developed by the Society of Automotive Engineers, and it creates a grading level of automation to measure how automated a vehicle is. And as you can see, it starts at 0, which is no automation, and goes all the way to full automation, number 5, where there's almost no driver assistance required. As of now, we have gotten to level 4, high automation, where it's just below a 5. The vehicle is capable of performing all driving functions under certain conditions, but the driver does have the option to control the vehicle. At this time, no level 5 car has been publicly deployed. Now, obviously, with this technology, as with a lot of technologies, there's a lot of challenges. First, combining heavy equipment plus complex software is difficult both from a design and an engineering perspective. Driving a car is a complex operation involving the flawless simultaneous execution of a billion tiny and subtle reflexes. A self-driving car must correctly identify and label millions of objects, as well as understand city layouts and traffic laws and operate in a variety of conditions. Second, liability. Who's responsible when accidents happen? The driver, the vehicle, the software. Indeed, this is a subject that's being discussed right now. Third, cost. Now, these self-driving vehicles require a variety of special sensors and computers and controls, which currently cost tens of thousands of dollars at the outset. Obviously, unaffordable to all but the most affluent commuters and drivers. There could be a non-ownership business model, as with the ride-sharing characterized by Uber and Lyft. I'll get into that a little bit later, but that could alleviate some of the cost. The full benefits of automotive vehicle deployment may not be realized for a while. Chances are in the early stages, only a portion of total vehicle travel on any given section of roadway is going to have autonomous vehicles, so the benefits are likely to be limited. For full system level benefits, including increased traffic densities, narrower traffic lanes, reduction in parking supply, elimination of traffic signals, this will require that most or almost all of the vehicle population on any given segment of roadway is autonomous. So that's not going to happen for a while. Limited market penetration initially, similar to number 4, which we just described. Again, at least in the initial phases, the operation of autonomous vehicles are going to be most likely optimized for dense urban areas, where the people who live there are not as dependent or not as likely to be dependent on cars as those who live in suburban and rural areas. Most of the discussion on AVs today are focused on more urban environments, so it's a little unclear how this technology will work in low density and more rural areas. And economic impacts. Many people today, or at least the time of this article was written, do rely on driving a vehicle as their livelihood and could lose their jobs. Again, statistics from just last year, there were approximately 1.7 million truck drivers, as well as 1.7 million bus, taxi, and delivery drivers. So needless to say, they're not encouraging this technology, or they're worried about it. So now I just want to describe a little bit of what's being done, and I think I like this slide because it shows that what's being done mostly now is a lot of research. And on this screen, here's two facilities, test facilities. On the left is University of Michigan, M-City, and it's being used by automakers to test and experiment with self-driving cars. M-City is the world's first full-scale simulated urban environment designed expressly for testing the performance and safety of automated and autonomous vehicles under controlled and realistic road conditions. And to the right here is a similar facility from Penn State in Pennsylvania. It, together with the city of Pittsburgh, was designated in January of 2017 as one of 10 U.S. DOT autonomous vehicle proving grounds in the country. And these are just two research facilities. There's a number of other ones all around the country. Now this next slide, I'm not going to go into it in detail. The table is in the article. I just wanted to kind of outline the range of impacts as well as the time periods that people and professionals are expecting from the deployment of AVs. And you can see like become legal, or the legal issues. Like I said earlier, that's being done now. You can see 2015 to 2025. You scroll or you go down to the bottom of this table, it says need to plan for mixed traffic as an impact. Well, this will probably occur when the major share of the vehicles are autonomous. And as per this chart, this is 20 to 40 years away, 2040 to 60s. And then it's even further away, this mandated autonomous vehicles, where most vehicles are autonomous and the large benefits are proven. So again, 2060 to 80s, that's 40 to 60 years away. So you can see there's a wide time horizon spanning a lot of the impacts, much longer than 20 years, which is the typical horizon of a long-range transportation plan. So the last two slides, I just want to talk about some considerations for planners. First, increased public investment in research and development in the technology. And as has been seen from the news, I mean, Uber had a self-driving vehicle that hit a pedestrian in March and hit and killed a pedestrian. So we all can see that the AV technology is far from flawless. Second, paradigm shift, mobility as a service. This was touched on a little bit in the previous presentation, but basically, to the average American, auto ownership is perceived as a birthright. Under this mobility as a service concept, transportation services are provided through a unified gateway, generally in the form of a mobile or web app or centralized website that procures and manages the trip. And of course, the ride-sharing and e-hailing services such as Uber and Lyft operate under this principle. It's my contention that if autonomous vehicles are ever to take off in a meaningful way, they will most likely use this paradigm, at least in the beginning, the existing e-hailing services and taxis in the beginning. Third, incentivize alternative modes. Now, as planners, we currently incentivize alternative modes to encourage people to take transit for environmental reasons and carpool. And we should still continue doing that, but we should also continue to incentivize ride sharing because, again, I think this will help create kind of the infrastructure, if you will, to accommodate AV deployment. Trade-offs between reduced parking and increased congestion. The table that I showed just a few slides ago, one of the impacts, or it suggested that with widespread deployment of autonomous vehicles, there could likely be a reduction in parking demand, and there could also be increased congestion due to the increased AV trips. Obviously, these purposes may work at cross purposes against one another. So Planning agencies and planners should be aware of the potential trade-offs between reduced parking and increased congestion. Cultural shift in travel behavior, this kind of ties into the paradigm shift of mobility as a service. And I think what I really meant was planners should start again or continue promoting like TDM strategies, like alternative work schedules, because in the case of AV, shifting the peak demand across a wider span of time will allow AVs to operate during a longer portion of the day and potentially increase the utilization. Land use strategies to accommodate AV operation. Now, as planners and planning professionals, we can and should continue to research best practice land use strategies that allow for a greater density of the mixed use and create an environment more conducive to AV operation. Obviously, most of these land use policy changes are difficult to implement, given that land use decisions are largely a function of local government, and alteration of land use policies usually entails altering the zoning code, which, as we all know, can amount to a very time-consuming and contentious process. But again, that's, these are things we should be thinking about. Next, the legal issues. I mentioned the liability earlier. Planning for mixed traffic, and again, this is more of a longer-term impact, but ultimately, if as AV deployment takes off, there's going to be a much more wider variety of the traffic mix in terms of the traditional, conventional, manually operated vehicles, is kind of illustrated in this schematic here, and then the automated vehicles, which is illustrated here. And again, this is just kind of a schematic to give you a general idea. But the point is, the traffic mix is going to be a lot more complex. The time to begin planning is now. Though it will be a while before AV deployment becomes widespread and market saturation is reached, local governments should move beyond the wait-and-see attitude and begin to take action. According to a Florida State University study for Florida DOT, AV technology has the potential to transform transportation systems and land use patterns to a level not seen since the mass production of the private automobile roughly a century ago. So that's pretty profound, I think. And finally, planning must account for uncertainty. While there's agreement that AVs are the next major trend in transportation, there's still a lot of uncertainty regarding how the technology will be implemented. For example, how long it will take for it to be fully deployed, the mix of vehicles as previously discussed, the ownership model, whether it's private ownership or shared use, and et cetera, et cetera. In short, planning needs to be agile, flexible, and adaptable. And that concludes my talk, and thank you for your attention. Okay.
All right. Thank you, David. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nathan Hicks, and I'm a transportation planner here in CDM Smith's Miami office. My article focuses on recent advancements in automated counting of bicyclists and pedestrians, and some of the implications that current research and initiatives may have for the future, and also why this additional research is needed for counting bicyclists and pedestrians. So before I get into some of the advancements, I'd like to talk about what is used now, why, and some of the implications of these current usages. When talking to most municipalities or MPOs, which are the bulk of the agencies that do this type of work, they often mention that counting bicyclists or pedestrians, they use infrared devices, pneumatic tubing, piezoelectric strips, or simply having somebody stand on the side of the road with a clipboard. Some of us today may have even done that last one. And if you have, you know there are some limitations to this kind of data. You cannot be out there for a long time, especially here in Florida. Being out there for more than a few hours is incredibly difficult. So you could really only capture a short perspective of how many bicyclists or pedestrians there may actually be along a certain facility or at an intersection. And so while these current methodologies aren't perfect, they have been studied significantly. And so extrapolations from this kind of data can be used with a strong degree of confidence. We recently ran into some of these issues as well when we undertook a non-motorized transportation data collection study for the Florida Department of Transportation. Even though we use newer devices and we install them in various settings, we found there were some limitations due to environmental interferences or just limitations due to the physical sites themselves. Things like reflections or shadows can significantly interfere with some of the data that is received and cause abnormalities. So how is the field of automated bicycle and pedestrian counting changing, and where does it seem to be heading? There's been considerable research in the field of automated and connected vehicles. Thank you, David, for mentioning that. And much of this centers on computer vision. This research has opened the doors for other applications as well, specifically the application of counting bicyclists and pedestrians more easily. And while this research is able to count bicyclists and pedestrians more easily, there are also other types of analyses that can be undertaken as well. For example, being able to determine direction, speed, classifying users as a bicyclist or a pedestrian, helmet usage, and potential conflicts between users and vehicles at an intersection are some incredibly important factors that can be determined using computer vision for bicyclists and pedestrians. Specifically, safety analyses at intersections are one example, which could potentially further the goal of Vision Zero, and I will get into that more in a bit in some few more slides. In addition, behavior analyses is another potential use of this type of research. And I'd like to highlight two researchers who have made considerable strides in using computer vision towards this application. Bernardo Pires, who is a research scientist at the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, and Dr. Tariq Saeed, who is the director of UBC's Bureau of Intelligent Transportation Systems and Freight Security. Both of these researchers have completed studies and are still doing research using computer vision for counting bicyclists and pedestrians. Bernardo and his team of researchers conducted testing with their algorithms. Oh, my apologies, everybody. I believe I opened up an old slide, an old presentation. I will open up the correct one here. My apologies. Thank you. Sorry for the delay. As I was saying, Bernardo Pires and his team of researchers conducted testing of their algorithms using bicycle and pedestrian video data. After installing a mobile counting device, the Intelligent Mobility Meter, which is something they developed, and recording and processing the data, they were able to classify bicyclists and pedestrians correctly with a 95% accuracy during the classification process. While this is considerably high, there is also variability due to other conditions. The type of environment, low light settings can affect the classification process significantly. Here is one example of what the computer sees itself. Here we can see the pedestrians and the bicyclists using a screen line test to a parking lot entrance. Here we can see the pedestrians with their footpath, their steps tracked by the computer with these purple and green circles, as well as the bicyclists tracked here as well. So not only is the direction analyzed by the computer, but the speed is as well, which helps classify these users into either a bicyclist or a pedestrian. The other researcher I mentioned, Dr. Tariq Saeed, has achieved similar results and more in his research. He was able to determine whether these users were wearing a helmet and potential conflicts between vehicles, both of which are critical for safety analyses. For example, he mentioned in one of his studies, bicyclists who wore helmets were more likely to travel at faster speeds. While this point makes sense, it is an important safety factor, and it is great to have data backing up this point. But as we can also see, the variability for accuracy in his study was between 85 to 96% to classify bicyclists and pedestrians. So more research and testing is needed. Here it is an example of a image of an intersection in China. We can see all the various, many of the various vehicles, pedestrians, bicyclists have been categorized or have been classified and have been noted by the computer. Now, unfortunately, I can't show the video, but here we would be able to see what directions they're taking and potential conflicts throughout this intersection. Here is an example of how this type of research and how this type of testing could impact not only just counting of bicyclists and pedestrians, but also additional research and before and safety analyses. This is an image of an intersection where there is currently no scramble phase for pedestrians. They must walk from one side to the other, here, 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 etc. After this has been installed, the researchers were able to go back and look at potential conflicts, dwelling time here at the corners, and determine what sorts of changes happened from this type of intersection improvement. And overall found that safety was improved, pedestrians had to wait at the intersection less, and overall was an improvement for all modes. So what can we come to expect for this type of analysis and this type of automated counting? While more research is needed, of course, to improve accuracy and lower the cost of analyses, this has the potential to drastically change how we count bicyclists and pedestrians. One important limitation, though, is the fact that powerful computers are needed to analyze the video that is coming into them. Also, it can take a significant amount of time to analyze the images. So that is one aspect that's kind of limiting this type of research. As well, new modes come into play. As I'm sure many people have seen, dockless scooters have been implemented in many cities, including here in Miami. And those sorts of new modes have to be adjusted and accounted for in order to avoid incorrect classification. Just as well, another limitation is low video resolution or low light conditions. Without high definition video or clear conditions, the accuracy of this type of counting drops significantly. And one more point, while I focused on automated counting with video, What about Bluetooth and aggregated data, such as Strava? Well, Bluetooth in particular, and there is a significant amount of research going on in that field. Actually, just at the recent NatMet conference in Irvine, California, there were a number of researchers that were able to show improved counting of pedestrians throughout various intersections, as well as I'm sure many people have heard of Strava and perhaps even used that data, though those data sets do have certain limitations and perhaps inherent biases with people who use that type of service or perhaps own or do not own a smartphone, though that can be adjusted for. So as we can see, there is a significant amount of research occurring, and it's fascinating to see how this is going to change bicyclists, the way that we measure and count and monitor bicyclists and pedestrians in the coming years. And I appreciate your time for today. Thank you. And I will turn it over to Les and Tim now.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. My name is Tim Storer. I'm working as an analyst at ICF, and I'll be presenting today on behalf of myself and my co-author, Wes Brown, on our article titled Transportation Agencies and Scenario Planning Approaches for the Uncertain Road Ahead. Quick disclaimer, while this presentation and its associated article draw heavily on work done under contract for the US DOT, this presentation and its related article reflects only the views of myself and my co-author, and is not an official presentation on behalf of US DOT. So with that, I'll just jump right in. So I want to start with a little bit of a comparison in history that some of you may be familiar with that underscores the importance of public policy within the context of shaping technology developments. And in this context, we talk a lot about autonomous and connected vehicles. Los Angeles, as some of you may know, in the early 1900s, had one of the world's largest transit systems and busiest pedestrian crossings. It was only after decades of very auto-centric actions, which contributed to reversing this trend, that it became now known as almost the standard kind of hallmark of congestion and sprawl and emissions that is known today in the transportation community, and ranks according to INRIX as the most congested city in the world. Portland, conversely, had a similar decision-making trajectory, and by the 1970s, much of its downtown was devoted to parking. In the 1980s, however, forward-thinking policies directed growth towards key corridors, facilitated density, and helped revitalize its economy. And today, Portland, as many of you may know, is routinely ranked as one of the best cities in the U.S. for bicycling, walking, and transit. So in the 1900s, when the advent of the affordable automobile was the primary sort of technological revolution at the time, we clearly saw how public policies, in combination with other factors, socio-demographic and economic and so forth, were very important in shaping how those technologies took hold and what their effects were. And we expect that new technological developments will be no different. So in this current environment, we have several new technologies that have been highlighted here, and thank you, David, for doing an excellent job in summarizing automated and connected vehicles, the primary two that we are discussing in our article and in this presentation. But it isn't just the new technologies as well. It's also very uncertain policy and behavioral contexts. When and how will automated vehicles be regulated? What are the relevant governing authorities? What sorts of industry agreements and standards and partnerships will arise? Are all very important questions and remain largely unanswered. And related to these technologies themselves are also a whole suite of emergent phenomena. Ride-hailing being perhaps the most obvious today, which is derivative of advances in mobile technology and widespread use of mobile phones and connectivity, and also data analytics. And there's also several others. David touched on multimodalism and this idea of mobility as a service, and the ability to more easily now than ever before plan trips across many different services in many modes are some of these example emergent phenomena. sorry, I realize maybe seeing some of this here. There we go. And then in addition to these emergent phenomena, we also have a whole suite of outcomes. Some of these are listed here, though there are certainly many more about how connected and automated vehicles can influence public sector activities as well as society as a whole. And there really is uncertainty at each of these phases. Uncertainty in what the technology itself will be able to do and when it will arrive, uncertainty in how it will be regulated and how standards and partnerships will evolve, uncertainty in how those will manifest in kind of new business models and emergent phenomenon, and then uncertainty in the outcomes of those things. So there's a lot of uncertainty for planners to deal with when making decisions that we know ultimately be very important in actually creating the cities of the future. So it is to that end that that we are discussing scenario planning as one of the possible methods for dealing with that uncertainty and helping public sector agencies optimize their assets and plan accordingly in a very new and exciting era. Scenario planning offers the benefits of being able to kind of explore past trajectories, current activities, and future trajectories, seeing what the various futures might look like, analyzing them very proactively, and assessing the opportunities and risks associated with those trajectories, and what agencies might currently be doing that could be obviated or that could be especially useful under certain scenarios in the future. And this is catching on right now in a big way, which I think is a very good thing. In 2015, the National League of Cities indicated only 6% of agencies had incorporated AVs into their planning, and not shown here, but even fewer, I believe 3% had incorporated transportation network companies such as Uber and Lyft in some fashion into their long-range plans in 2015. But even in 2018, that's jumped significantly to 36% of cities planning for autonomous vehicles in some capacity. And some of these early adopters are listed here, though there are many others and growing every day. So one of those examples we highlighted in our article that I'll detail a little further here is the Jacksonville Transportation Authority in Florida. And they conducted a scenario planning exercise in the spring of 2017, focused on identifying scenarios for the agency's role in a new technology context where there were connected and automated vehicles and all of the various emergent phenomena that they may create. So they conducted a literature review of what these technologies might be able to do and where they were now. They analyzed their existing and future plans based on their data that they had and other sorts of demographic forecasts. And they convened a workshop with peer agencies to form specific scenarios about what their agency, what its role might be in this context. And they had various scenarios, including some where the agency was much more involved and had a much more elaborate role in kind of conducting and managing these technologies, and others where it was much more on the sidelines, had a much smaller role, for example. And across all these scenarios, they examined them and they figured, well, how would agency goals change? How would the agency evolve in terms of the services it wanted to provide, and in how it engaged with other regulatory bodies and so forth. And they found they had various findings about how many of their goals would stay the same. The goal of a public transit system is still to ensure equity and provide access, and to have interdisciplinary connections with other fields of policy and all of these other things that JTA is working on now. And they identified several areas where their activities currently could be leveraged in a new technology context. So that's just one example. There are many others current and planned with agencies around the country. So FHWA's scenario planning project, which is the focus of this presentation and a big focus in the article as well, is to equip agencies to deal with uncertainty and to reduce the burden on state and local agencies in addressing CV and AV risks and opportunities, much like what was done in Jacksonville and in other areas in the country. Specifically, this project wanted to help agencies conduct an exploratory scenario planning kind of analysis, which unlike normative scenario planning, where you have various scenarios and you pick the one that works the best, that is the goal, and you try to achieve that scenario. Exploratory scenario planning rests on the idea that there are a whole bunch of exogenous factors that are really outside of the planners control that can create a whole range of different scenarios, and that you want to look across all those different scenarios and identify risks and opportunities present across all of them, and also figure out a means to identify which path you're heading towards and interpret new developments as you go along. So this project had several different kind of deliverables, so to speak, or final products. The first is the actual scenarios themselves. This project created 6 completely new future scenarios related to CV and AV that could be used by agencies across the country. They conducted 2 workshops, the first with industry and academic experts to refine and kind of stress those scenarios to make sure they were consistent and logical and at least somewhat plausible, although not necessarily equally so. The purpose of this was not to predict the future, but rather to kind of encapsulate the possible futures over a set of scenarios. And then the second workshop being to determine the impacts to planners. So there is a forthcoming final report which details the scenarios themselves and the process to create them and the rationale and all of that, as well as a practitioner guidance document that will be a standalone resource to planners to conduct their own scenario planning exercises and to take the very general 6 scenarios that we have and apply them to their specific regions around the country. So just a little bit on that process that I'll discuss today. We started with a whole list of drivers and levers, which included technological developments, consumer preferences, socioeconomic factors, government actions. All of these things have big roles to play in the timeline for CV and AV adoption, the way those technologies are used, and their impacts. But you can conceivably create future scenarios centering around any of these and many more that are not on these lists, but that would be cumbersome and just too many scenarios. We needed a more manageable number. So those drivers and levers were synthesized into what we call our 3 key uncertainties: connectivity, automation, and cooperation. Connectivity really just about what percentage of vehicles can both transmit and receive information on both long-term trip planning information, where is the traffic, what are the forecasts, and also immediate safety information, what cars around me are moving and how fast. And then automation, and David touched on the Society of Automotive Engineers levels of automation, so what kind of automotive level is available and affordable, and in what areas can they operate. And then lastly, this idea of cooperation was deemed to be very important, which is to what extent do agencies and companies adjust their operational practices and policies in accordance with other entities? This means to what extent are people integrating payment across lots of different modes? To what extent is there synchronization in schedules or multimodal infrastructure? So we have pickup and drop-off lanes at train stations more often than parking lots, for example, in the future. So those are the kinds of things that we consider cooperative developments. And all 3 of these categories are very important kind of key uncertainties that can shape different futures. So those were synthesized into 6 future scenarios. And in the interest of time, I won't detail these significantly here. Further information about them can be found in our final report, which is not released yet, but should be hopefully publicly available very soon. The project is still underway, though, so we do want to put that disclaimer on all of the names and details in these slides. But these are the 6 scenarios here, and the main takeaway with this is that they each have varying ratings along these scales, varying degrees of connectivity, automation, and cooperation in them that define what the scenario is like. And associated with each of these scenarios, there were analyses of their impacts and what to expect both from the perspective of planners and to society within each of them. This diagram here just shows kind of that and underscores that they are trajectories. The scenarios are not simply snapshots in time and saying this is what the world looks like. It also includes discussion of how the world would get there. They all take place in 2035, which was deemed to be a timeline roughly in line with a long-range planning process. And this basically just underscores those differences. Again, I just due to time constraints won't detail each of the scenarios individually. They are all, I think, fairly interesting and worth consideration, but we won't go into all of them today. So to maximize the usefulness of these scenarios, we hosted a second workshop where we brought in state and local planners from around the country and basically asked them under each of these scenarios, kind of run them. What would they mean for you? What do they mean for your planning? What things do you have that might be useless? What would be especially useful? What opportunities will arise? and kind of how do your operations change. And then on the second day of the workshop, we really kind of flipped the question and said, okay, how can we make a practitioner guidance document that is most useful to you? And what kind of final deliverable from this could actually help agencies take scenarios, analyze them, and then change plans and procedures. So here are some of just the common risks and commonly valuable actions. Just a sample, there's much more detail on this in our final report documentation. Because one of the benefits of scenario planning, well, it's not meant to directly predict the future. Any certain things that are identified as valuable across all scenarios. For example, digitizing road signage, speeds, and markings so they can be used for apps and for automated vehicle purposes is going to be useful under all of these scenarios. Even in ones with very low automation, where they have high connectivity, it could still be useful and certainly wouldn't be a negative in any of them. So we did this kind of analysis for all of these scenarios, and that's also present in the practitioner guidance for state and local officials as well. And here these are just all diagrams from our report, and this last one I'll touch on quickly. There's a lot of text here, but the main takeaway, if you look at the simplest case, which is our baseline in the middle, which is just basically a minimal plausible change scenario, what's the least different 2035 could look like versus today in terms of CV and AV. It simply says no further breakthroughs in CV or AV, only marginal growth. And to the other scenarios, you would see information about what are the key markers that would need to happen for that scenario to occur. And that's, we thought, is also very important in the scenario planning framework, because if you look at step 6 here, and I'll work backward kind of, it's to monitor industry and policy developments and have an understanding to help agencies understand what it means when we see big signing agreements, when you see, for example, Uber buying fleets of autonomous vehicles to operate in, and big signals like this, and in the future, any big regulatory programs and so forth. So the practitioner guidance starts off with defining and understanding CV and AV. What do we mean? And what are the definitions of these technologies? Determining goals and stakeholders in your planning process, and this would be very different for each agency. You know, who needs to be involved in the scenario planning exercise? Who are the people who have transportation stake in their region? And then third, understanding driving forces and scenario origins, understanding the scenarios simply. And then step 4 is the most critical part probably, and that's where these scenarios are tailored to the locality. And we have these scenarios were deliberately designed vague enough that they don't talk about specific kinds of systems or modes, but the idea is that localities would talk about how they manifest down to, in the most specific terms possible in their region. And then incorporate those kind of results and analysis of what it looks like in their region into their decision making. So that's the idea of the ultimate guidance we wanted to make from this project, and to help use scenario planning as a means to deal with uncertainty. And our conclusions from this product is more meant to provide guidance rather than as a report with traditional conclusions. But our kind of implicit conclusions are that scenario planning has been and will continue to be a very valuable tool for state and local planners at least, and possibly at other levels too. And there is no exact one-size-fits-all approach to scenario planning. I mean, there's different context, resources, and goals and perspectives. For JTA, that was defining the agency's role. For others, it might be just determining whether certain investments are valuable or something more narrow. So, yeah, and also normative and exploratory. In this context, we're talking about exploratory, so I wanted to mention that as well. But that's it. That's an overview of the project. And with that, I will turn things back to our webinar organizers. And thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's go ahead and get started with those questions. If you have them, just type them in the chat box again on your webinar tool panel. And just as a reminder, again, we will have the presentation available to download as a PDF at the conclusion. Just visit our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And we'll also have a recording available on our YouTube page. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. Okay, first question is for David and Karina. How is project monitoring carried out after the project is complete?
Okay, great. Great question. Yeah, we're just developing that process we speak. So we do have several large development projects that have been built that have similar travel demand management commitments. Today we get sort of the analog PDF or paper reports that we read, and they demonstrate compliance with the measure through measuring their average vehicle ridership at the site level. So they do on-site trip surveys of all, mostly employer sites today. We do want to transition this to residential, so large residential projects where they may have to have some sort of transportation coordination amongst their like a property management company or potentially membership with a transportation management organization. And that we would want to build in an incentive to participate with a TMO within our administrative framework to make that easy for those needing to comply with the TDM ordinance. But quite more simply, we will be looking at two metrics of average vehicle ridership and parking utilization as the performance metrics going forward.
Thank you. And while I have you, could you speak to the adaptability of the TDM model to other cities and to specifically suburban and rural environments?
Yeah, we've done that's another great question. So a lot of our understanding of how TDM works have been taken from studies of cities throughout California. Some of them have been in more suburban context. Some of them have been in urban context. But Karina, you want to speak to how we understand the city structure in terms of transportation behavior and how that may translate to other categories of areas? You've done a lot of work on this.
Yeah, sure. So what we did in LA was not only gather localized trip generation data from a variety of sites, which is pretty important in order to get your trip generation estimates as accurate as possible. We've also gone and defined different areas of the city based on their people's propensity to use transit in those areas, given street network connectivity, land use diversity, population density, daytime population density, and a number of other factors which we know to tend to influence travel decisions. And all of that has kind of culminated in this calculator. So other agencies interested in building something that's more localized, a development review process that's based on actual data, could be able to apply the same process as our city has done, but wouldn't be able to use this tool that's been built around LA-specific data.
One thing I would add is I think we're really excited about the potential for transportation services to better reach suburban areas. So kind of reflected in some of the other presentations about what it means to be in access to transit, that there are services that we feel that would be better suited to fit a more suburban context, like an on-demand type of transit service, if it's a particularly large new project developed in an area where there isn't a lot of transit service, to better fit that. And maybe this is a way we are looking at this as a way to better encourage shared vehicle use to build that bridge for that automated future.
Thank you. And for those, I just had someone type in, what is TDM? Transportation Demand Management.
Also known as mobility management or transportation demand management.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. Next question. Let's roll down to David Heller. Could you tell us why the automated bicycle and pedestrian counting, why China was used specifically in the research?
I'm sorry, was this for?
I believe this might have been for me.
Yeah, I think it was the other. It was it was for Nathan.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, not a problem. specifically, well, that was a study that Dr. Tariq Saeed had done in conjunction, I believe, with a university in China. So that's why that intersection was specifically used, was because it was referencing the study that was done there.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think this one was for David Heller. And folks, if you could type in who the question is for, that would also be helpful. The land use schematic doesn't include bikes and pedestrians. How do they fit in?
Okay, that's a good question, and to be honest, I didn't really I didn't focus on bikes and pedestrians in my talk. Mostly, obviously, there's a lot of content that I was trying to get across. So, but bicycle and pedestrians is definitely an important component. And off the top of my head, I can't give you an exact response, but as I think has been maybe not shown in this particular presentation, but I've seen in other presentations, you know, there's dedicated bike lanes and pedestrian walkways, maybe a little bit like in Nathan was doing the counts on a lot of those types of facilities. So I think those would, there would be a similar type of infrastructure with the automated vehicles. So that was a schematic. It was kind of designed to give the viewers a general idea of, you know, the vehicles, mix of vehicles, but definitely wasn't a comprehensive view of all the different considerations. So.
Okay, thank you. Nathan, were you in a congested urban area or a more wide open suburban area when you were doing your counting in Florida?
It was a little bit of everything, actually. What we did was we went to 26 various sites throughout South Florida, so there's definitely a bit more of a, I suppose, urban perspective, but we wanted to try and test in a multitude of settings, rural settings, suburban, etc. And we tried to use the recent classification system that the Florida Department of Transportation came out with, context land use classification zone, as part of their Complete Streets initiative. So we would identify a few various sites based off of those criteria, and whether those sites were counted in the past, the way we could compare previously collected data to what we collected. And that was for the most part, where we counted. So we did count in some schools, school zone areas. Some were on trails, some were on roadways, or I guess you could say more urban arterials. We couldn't test in every single specific setting. We had to essentially narrow it down to what was available or what we thought was critical. But like I was saying, it was 26 sites, and some were on one side of the roadway and some were on both sides. And for each of those sites, we used passive infrared devices. We used automated video, as well as pneumatic tubing, either on the sidewalk, on the bicycle lane if there was one, or on both, as well as in some instances we used Bluetooth, although we had mixed results with that particular type of device.
Thank you. Dockless bicycles have been introduced in the New York City area, where the bikes can be left wherever the rider gets off, and then someone can come by and ride the same bike away. Is this kind of bike introduction going to skew the results of counts in environments that have this type of dockless bicycle system?
Well, I'm assuming that was for me.
Yes.
Okay. It depends on what the definition of skew. Technically, if somebody begins and ends a trip, that would be their trip. If anything, the advent of dockless bicycles and dockless scooters And those types of modes show a demand that is potentially not being met. But when somebody completes that trip in that area, it's showing that there is that demand. So in my opinion, no, it wouldn't skew it. If anything, it just shows what people actually would want to do instead.
Okay, thank you. Hey, real quick, Tim, could you, I don't know if you have this as a PowerPoint or if you have this as a PDF. Are you able to edit David Heller's email contact info? We need to add an S. Let me see here.
Yes, D. Heller, I'm sorry if you don't mind. D. Heller at sjtpo.org.
It's in our little chat box.
Oh, okay. I can.
If you can
try
see,
to,
do you see it there? Okay, thank you. I just want to make
do you
sure
want me to
that
try to do it on? Do you want me to try to do it on the screen now?
yeah, go right ahead. Yeah, just so that if folks want to contact them, they have the right info.
Sure. Can you read that off one more time?
Just add an S as in Sam right after your at.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. No problem.
And let's see, next question. Okay, for urbanists who are interested in active transport, such as walking and biking, and land use patterns that support carless lifestyles, do you think autonomous cars will help or hurt? And I guess this could really be for anybody.
I guess this is Tim Storer. I'll jump in briefly on that, but certainly the other panelists should feel free to jump in as well. I think that, and this is perhaps an unsatisfying answer, but I think it is really context dependent and unclear. I think that could very easily, if you fast forward to 2035, for example, and look at any given city in the world, you could see two very different trajectories as to how these technologies manifest in terms of how they affect other modes and the overall multimodal, car-free lifestyle and the degree to which that's possible. That's kind of our impetus for doing this project. I really do believe that certainly policy, but also other variables as well, cultural factors and things like that play a role. It may not be, looking internationally, especially too, there are certain cities that have cultures and density that could be especially favorable to kind of using these technologies in very targeted ways that could be really effective. So it's a question that I think remains very unclear, but if you can narrow it to a specific place, it will, I think, will become a little bit clearer and will clarify over time. So that's my answer.
Okay.
Hi, this is Karina from LADOT. Just to add to that, it really is going to depend on how local jurisdictions build their infrastructure, not only their physical concrete, but also how they actively manage and communicate with any new technology. And that really, building out that level of short-range communication with these new vehicles is going to take a lot of planning and testing right now, so that when we do have some sort of either shared or private autonomous fleet, we'll have all of the systems in place to be able to regulate and enforce and communicate with them, so that they use the streets that we would like to designate for them to use. And it becomes much more collaborative rather than having the city catch up.
Thanks. Okay, next question. What should planners do to ensure that companies like Uber don't have massive negative impacts on bus riders, people with disabilities, low-income folks? The companies growing this tech and mobility as service are very good at making sure there is no mandatory regulation. Anyone want to take this one?
Sure. This is Tim Storer. I'll jump in briefly on it. It's a big question, but I guess the first thing is the question implies negative impacts. So yes, it is definitely the case that if, for example, services like Uber or Uber Pool or Uber Express Pool cannibalize bus ridership so much that bus lines are discarded, and instead it's just kind of that public transportation is privatized, no oversight. It's very foreseeable there could be situations where specific populations, geographically or demographically, are left out, and traditional equity concerns of the public sector have been left to the public sector fall by the wayside, and that would be bad. But conversely, there's lots of ways those technologies can be used to actually help those people. I mean, there have been successful pilots already in Boston, for example, where their paratransit service also is using, I believe I can't remember if it's Uber or Lyft, one of the two, perhaps both now actually, in addition to traditional paratransit vans as part of their service called The Ride, where users who feel perfectly comfortable getting into an Uber or Lyft, instead of calling the traditional paratransit van, can get in those and drive around. They find that service is more convenient. Actually, it's helping them. It's helping those riders. That's what they would report. It's very popular, as I understand it. So that's an example. There are many other examples. So I think it's a complicated question. I think the crux of the question really isn't whether Uber and Lyft are going to ruin public transit. I think the better way to phrase the question is, what is public transit when you have Uber and Lyft? So that's kind of how I'd reframe it.
I would also just look at reframing it around like how are funding sources for transportation. If we're thinking about, especially in the world of autonomous vehicles, I think it highlights the need, and especially in congested urban areas, to think seriously about congestion pricing and how creating that as a revenue source could potentially balance those that might be hit by congestion pricing fees to fund transit services to continue to providing that subsidized service relative to the cost of riding a personalized vehicle. So I think it does urge the evaluation of strategies that have already been before us and that may even have greater urgency.
And I would go back and agree with Tim. I think what's really changing is the role of the public transit agency, the role of Uber. These companies are so new that these roles and responsibilities haven't yet been clearly defined, and with the tech sector in general, things change so quickly. So seeing those changes come into play is interesting, and they're going to have to be defined, more well defined in the coming years.
Thanks. Interesting question. Nathan, what is the most dangerous intersection for pedestrians and bicyclists in South Florida?
Oh, goodness. Most dangerous.
Or perhaps rephrasing it as, what makes a dangerous intersection for pedestrians and bicyclists?
Well, I'll speak more to, I suppose, here in South Florida, we do have density, but we also have very large urban arterials, and it's not uncommon on these urban arterials for people to speed much more than the current speed limit is set. And in conjunction with the land use, which is a significant amount of lower density single family homes, people want to get where they're going faster, and which kind of leads to the speeding. So probably, more than likely, there are some of the intersections in downtown which would be probably most dangerous, but those intersections in particular, the ones that are on those urban arterials, especially with ones that are kind of near pedestrian centers, those are, I would have to say, the most dangerous of the ones. I'm sure many people have heard about the bridge collapse near FIU. That bridge was going across to a new housing complex that was right across from FIU. And that sits on Southwest H Street, which is an incredibly dangerous road and one of those types of urban arterials in particular. That bridge was needed because of the type of roadway that's there. So that's a good example, I suppose, of one that's most dangerous because that's a very common way that the roads down here in South Florida are built. They are making changes, but it's slow but sure.
Okay, anyone else have any comments on specifically what makes an intersection dangerous for a pedestrian or a bicyclist?
Well, Dave Heller here, just if I can chime in. I mean, in our area, South Jersey, it's pretty rural for the most part, and there's a lot of four-way stop signs, or there even could be just to stop. One part of the intersection has stop signs, and the other is just through traffic. So I think that makes it very dangerous. I mean, there's a lot of parts of our region. There's no sidewalks, and I mean bike lanes. It's common in the more tourist areas like the New Jersey Shore along there, but in like in the center part of South Jersey, Vineland area, it's there's almost no accommodation for bicycles and pedestrians, and even like I said, shortage of sidewalks. So again, we're a rural area, but we do obviously measure this accident and crash statistics, including bicycle and pedestrian fatalities, and so it's a big issue, I think, on a lot of the rural roads. I don't know if that applies to some of these areas because it seems like most of the other panelists are from more urban areas, but I think I've seen that and observed that here.
Okay, thank you. This is interesting. How are autonomous vehicle adoptions integrating health considerations? Autonomous vehicles and technology are likely to reduce the amount of walking and biking. Has anyone looked at this? Will a vehicle being autonomous really make a difference between, would someone be apt to drive a vehicle regardless if it was autonomous or not versus taking public transportation or walking or biking? Does anyone have any comments on that?
I guess I'll chime in, Dave Heller. Now, I didn't address this in my paper or in my article, so it's a very good question. I do think my first reaction is that it's kind of what the question a couple minutes ago about the person who asked about Uber and Lyft and accommodating the lower income or the disadvantaged populations. I see autonomous vehicles definitely helping them, people with difficulty walking or disabled or can't afford a car. I definitely see that. So as far as in a broad sense, I think that'll help improve the community's health, the global health, in terms of people can get to medical appointments and doctor's visits or things like that. But in terms of active transportation, like walking or biking, that's a good question. I do think I can't really give a good answer, but I think that would be a challenge.
I'll chime in for a second. It is a good question, and the impacts for bicycling and pedestrians and walking, it's important. And I think part of that comes down to cost, how much these types of services cost. Here in Miami, we have a multitude of free trolley or transit services, and it's not uncommon for people to shift their mode from perhaps walking or bicycling to taking that. But in terms of Uber and Lyft or some other type of automated vehicle in the future, I think it depends, honestly, how much it would cost to get from that, maybe that 1 mile trip.
Nathan, oh, go ahead. Was someone going to say something else?
Yeah, sure. This is Tim Starr. I'll add some brief comments to that as well. I think that the short answer, I think, is if you have advances in road technologies that make it cheaper and more accessible and otherwise easier to use, all else equal, more people will do it instead of walking included. So if the question is, will automated vehicles make people walk less and instead ride in automated vehicles, I think it's absolute yes. It's a little bit more complicated when you think that the future doesn't just include advances in automated vehicles. There's advances in all kinds of other modes, including things like scooters and bikes and the ability for people to access those modes too. So I don't think you need to view that in isolation. But even already, if you're talking, and I completely agree with the previous point about it all depends how much it costs as well and whether people are willing to pay it for the last mile. But even already, there is data suggesting that Uber and Lyft, especially Uber Pool and Lyft Line, and especially in rainy weather, are already pulling trips from walking. You know, people who walk to the grocery store and get there and find it's raining will easily, no-brainer, pull those apps to bring themselves home rather than walk. So then that might cost a little over $2 a mile, but most reports suggest that if you have an automated shared use electric fleet that has an efficient ride matching algorithm, they could conceivably get user costs down to less than 30 cents a mile. So in that case, it's pretty hard to imagine how it wouldn't cannibalize walking at least a little, is my answer. But others feel free to share their thoughts, but I think that's kind of right.
Okay, I just took a look at the time and I think we're just going to go ahead and wrap up now. If you did not get your question answered, feel free to reach out to the panelists for today. Thanks to all of you for joining today. Gabrielle, I know you're hanging around somewhere on the line, so thank you for the transportation division from that perspective for coordinating everything today, and everyone behind the scenes who I've spoken with, who's gotten you all together. Thank you into the Transportation Planning Division for sponsoring today's webcast. Again, the PDF presentation will be available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and we'll also have a recording available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great weekend.